Hey, welcome back. So for those of us joining us just now, I'd said earlier that unfortunately Petra cannot be with us today, unfortunately. So I have provided a talk. It's a recorded session. And it's just about my experimenting with ChatGPT. It's a journey that I took, and I share with some of my trainees on my teacher training program. And I thought it would fill a gap that we had in the program this morning. It does sort of reiterate some of the points that have already been made, and I hope there's not too much repetition. Um, and Sorry, I was just checking the chat. Okay, so without further ado, I will set the recording in motion, and we'll stop, and there'll be chance for questions if anybody has any. So thank you very much. My journey using ChatGPT for course development. So first of all, I'll explain the process I went through and its different iterations. We'll look at some of the hallucinations that occurred along the way. And please don't worry if you don't understand that term, all will become clear. And then finally, I'll sum up what I took away from this little experiment. So I was inspired to take you on this journey following a business English webinar that I attended run by Rob Howard. Now, Rob is a business English trainer and former co-coordinator of IATEFL BSIG. During his webinar, Rob took us through his journey into creating an entire course for his business executives using AI. He wanted, amongst other things, to see how long it would take him to create a course using AI, a task that would normally have taken several hours. Now, I was a little skeptical at first, but what he produced, although not perfect, certainly inspired me to experiment myself. Rob had been asked to create a course to teach learners how to use a particular business framework with a series of stages, not unlike the clinical communications models that we use in healthcare. So for my experiment, I decided to use some of the same prompts, but swapping Rob's business framework for the spikes model. Let me show you what happened. So to begin with, I selected my target audience, a group of 18 third-year medical students at a faculty in France with a B2 level of English. The aim would be to devise a mini course about how to use the spikes model. The course would be 6 hours in total and taught over a series of 6 lessons. Just like Rob, I began by researching the communication model. So I asked ChatGPT the following questions. What is the history of the spikes model? Who uses it? What's it for? And how effective is it? I know quite a lot about spikes, so I was intrigued to see what ChatGPT would come up with. Well, within seconds, ChatGPT had provided me with a detailed explanation of the spikes model, including who first introduced it, the type of context it's used in, and the level of effectiveness. ChatGPT also points out the limitations of spikes and concludes by saying that it has proven to be an invaluable source for healthcare professionals tasked with delivering bad news. By providing a clear, step-by-step framework, Spikes improves quality of communication, fosters empathy, and reduces the psychological impact of both patients and healthcare providers. Excellent. So far, so good. Armed with the knowledge of what the Spikes model consisted of, when it's used, and by whom, I was ready to start designing my course content. Following Rob Howard's format, I began by asking ChatGPT for 20 keywords related to the Spikes model and their definitions. And here are the first 10 of those words. ChatGPT reassured me that these were the words relevant to the communication skills and emotional intelligence required when applying the Spikes model in a healthcare setting. Now, looking at the words and their definitions, I could certainly see many that were of use and may indeed be new to my third year medical students. Words like empathy, perception, and consent, as well as the difference between diagnosis and prognosis. Next step was to ask ChatGPT to create 60-minute lessons for my target audience. And following Rob's example, I asked it to base the lessons around the 620 keywords. So, following my third prompt, ChatGPT proceeds to deliver 6 lesson plans. It also seeks to reassure me about the methodology it's used behind this course development by telling me that each lesson follows a progression of activities to reinforce vocabulary learning, integrate medical communication skills, and foster the application of these skills in a clinical context. I did indeed feel somewhat reassured. That was until I started looking at the lesson plans in a little more detail. Here are 2 of the lesson plans that ChatGPT produced. Lesson 1 is an introduction to spikes, and Lesson 3 focuses on dealing with patient emotions and demonstrating empathy. Take a moment to look through them yourselves. What are your thoughts? On initial reading, they might not look too bad. The objectives are clearly stated, there's a nice flow to the activities with realistic timings for each one. There's a variety of tasks and text types, and even some recycling. I particularly like some of the tasks in Lesson 3. The case study, for example, where learners are asked to predict the patient's emotional responses. And this is followed by an analysis of a video clip where learners can see a healthcare professional in action and where learners can discuss how effective the professional has been in demonstrating empathy. A closer look at the lesson plans, however, does throw up some problems. For me, the focus on the 20 keywords is problematic. Training medical students on how to use the Spikes model requires some functional language and key phrases for each stage. But unfortunately, these have not been provided, and this is because the 20 key words have taken precedence and have become the target language. One of the other main issues is the lack of resources. Now, the lesson plans refer to using case studies and videos and audios, which is great, but none of them have been provided. So I think we need another prompt. Still following Rob's example, I then requested videos, role plays and articles for each of the 6 lessons. And this is what it produced. Great. Or so I thought. Now, the resources proposed look fairly credible. The oncologist, for example, is a very reliable source, and oncology is an area of medicine where significant research has been carried out into the breaking of bad news for obvious reasons. Indeed, the key proponents of the Spikes model published their work in this very same journal. However, instead of taking me to a specific article, the link AI had proposed took me to the landing page for the oncologist and not the article. I realised that this was AI hallucinating. If you've not heard of the term, it's when AI algorithms generate false information or misleading results. They look plausible, just like this one, but aren't in fact real. Unfortunately, according to research carried out by IBM in 2023, chatbots like ChatGPT hallucinate 27% of the time. So definitely something to be very wary of. All was not lost, however. Some of the links AI had given me led to searches that included lots of very interesting alternatives, including this video on the right from the Geeky Medics that I'd forgotten about, and a link to YouTuber Dr. Kevin Foe, who is really somebody worth checking out. I also found the Empathetics podcasts, which proved to be really excellent, not podcasts that I had been aware of previously. So the search actually gave me a chance to work on my own CPD in this particular area of breaking bad news. So as I said, all was not entirely lost. Now back to prompting. At this point, I had to depart from Rob's example as he hadn't included roleplay in his particular course. This meant writing my own prompts, which, as you'll see, were a bit of a trial and error. For my first prompt, I asked AI to write 6 role plays between a medical professional and a patient or parent using the Spikes model. The patients should include a student with a sports injury. Here's one of the role plays. Take a moment to read through the card. As you can probably guess, it wasn't quite what I was expecting. I thought I would receive 2 role cards for each role play with instructions for the patient and the doctor. I also didn't expect to be given the first few lines of a dialogue. Obviously, the prompt I had given wasn't clear enough. So I wrote a second one, this time being a little bit more specific. What AI produced this time round was much more what I had in mind. There were instructions for each role, and these were clearly based on the Spikes model, as you can see. Certainly material that for me was very usable. So I've been quite impressed with the second set of roleplay cards, and I thought it would be worthwhile exploiting these a little further. So how about a sample dialogue that we could use in class for some discourse analysis? I asked ChatGPT to create a sample dialogue based on roleplay card number 2. This is the result. I'll give you a moment to read through it. Now, while I was on a good run with ChatGPT, I thought it would be interesting to see how well it would carry out discourse analysis. So I asked it to do just that, using the prompt, write feedback for the doctor based on the dialogue for role play 2. To what extent did the doctor use the Spikes model and how effective was he? This is the first part of the evaluation based on the Spikes model. I thought it was pretty good. It had picked up on the setting, It had picked up on the doctor's exploration of the patient's perception, and it had picked up on how he had invited the patient's thoughts about the type or amount of information that the patient wanted. I'll now give you a moment to read through the second part of the evaluation using the spikes model. It is worth noting at this point that even ChatGPT gets a bit tired. I found that when I tried entering prompt 8, it was quick to tell me I'd reached my time limit for the free version and that I needed to stop, but just for an hour. So I took a break. Following my break, I went back to ChatGPT to complete my journey. The final prompt was to create an assessment for my 6-hour mini course together with an assessment sheet. ChatGPT came back with an assessment task and this evaluation grid to assess the learner's ability to complete each of the 6 stages of the Spikes model. Now again, I thought this was pretty good. There's a maximum score of 24 and it provides detailed descriptors for each grade 1 to 4. Immediately, I felt that this was something I could make good use of, not just for this particular course, but it could also be used for evaluating qualified professionals as well, and as well as learners from different healthcare professions. Now, thanks to Rob's guidance, I'd now come to the end of my journey, my first attempt at designing a course purely using AI. It was certainly an interesting journey, and although it hadn't been as fruitful as I'd hoped, my time hadn't been entirely wasted. I'd come out with some useful resources, the roleplay cards, the assessment grid, and a great introductory text about the Spikes model. I'd also come across some useful links to podcasts and videos that I wasn't familiar with myself. As I mentioned earlier, the problem seemed to be the initial prompts that had resulted in the focus being on the 20 key words. This was obviously an approach that had worked for Rob in his particular context, but for various reasons it hadn't been the right one for healthcare and definitely not for a course about the Spikes model. I'm sure you'd agree this required a more functional approach with more focus on the clinical communications model itself. Not to be deterred, I decided to have another attempt at creating a course using AI. This time I decided to reverse the process and start with the assessment grid ChatGPT had provided me during my first attempt. So I attached the PDF of the assessment grid and devised a similar prompt, making reference to the grid. Interestingly, the course outline is the same as the first version. However, the lesson plans themselves were quite different. What I liked about this version was the focus on the Spikes model itself as opposed to a set of key vocabulary. And it was more clearly structured around developing learners' understanding and usage of the model. Already I could see the positive result of my improved prompt. Now let's look at some of the strengths and weaknesses of the new set of lesson plans. I've provided you with lesson 1, which is an introduction, and lesson 3, which is about assessing the patient's perspective. Take a moment to read through one of these lesson plans and think about its strengths and weaknesses. Let's look at strengths first. The objectives are clearly stated at the beginning of each lesson and all seem appropriate and achievable within 60 minutes. The course introduces learners to the key concepts they need to understand when delivering bad news effectively, some of which might be entirely new to them. It provides key phrases for each stage of spikes. In lesson 3, for example, we can see phrases such as, "Do you know why you've been asked to come in today?" And although it could be more effectively delivered as an open question, this is still an acceptable question to explore the patient's perspective. I also like the fact the role play incorporates use of an observer who can analyze usage and feedback to the person taking the role of the doctor. A homework task has been provided for each lesson, and these are often reflective tasks. Finally, there's a cultural element included in some of the lesson plans. This was a definite improvement on the first attempt, where there had been no mention of cultural differences, despite reference to the target audience being French in my original prompts. When it comes to weaknesses, unlike the first version, there's no inclusion of video, audio, or case studies, and that I find is quite a shame. There are other weaknesses, but I'll allow you to make your own judgments on that score. In lesson 1, learners are asked to reflect on the challenges of breaking bad news in French and in English. So I thought it would be interesting to look into this in a little more detail. So I asked ChatGPT to elaborate on these cultural challenges. And in my opinion, it did pretty well. As you can see from this first example, the fact empathy is less readily expressed in France will already have an impact on the healthcare professional's ability to demonstrate this in their encounter with patients. Now, coupled with this is the fact that historically there has been very little focus on clinical communications training in France, although this is changing. Now, obviously, this information in terms of cultural differences can be used in lots of different ways with the learners, but it also serves as a key insight for the trainer when working with this particular target audience. Now, if you're wondering, were there any more hallucinations? Well, sadly, there were. In fact, when I requested examples of video, audio, and case studies, the list of resources it produced was actually worse than the first time round. Now, finally, to my conclusion and lessons learned. It's been an interesting experiment to try and create an entire course using just AI. It is very much trial and error, and certainly working on developing effective prompts is extremely important. Obviously, Spikes is a tool that I know very well, but I would definitely consider using AI in the future to develop an aspect of our field that I was less familiar with. It kind of gives you the confidence and the motivation that you might need to broach new subjects in healthcare. And if nothing else, it provides a good starting point. But I would endeavour to carry out checks on the materials before using them in class, and I would most definitely warn against relying on it entirely. The important point I'd like to make before we finish is not to forget the key issues around materials development in this field. So carrying out a solid needs analysis, ensuring authenticity both in terms of texts and tasks, making sure that what we expect from our learners is meaningful and that skills, functional language and grammar are fully integrated. When asked, ChatGPT gave me this final piece of advice. Always review, adapt and localize any content that is AI generated. Design your prompts in a way that includes information about level, healthcare setting, and any specific communicative goals. It also advises that we vet content for any stereotypes or biases that might creep in, and finally iterate. Make use of AI for first drafts or brainstorming, but then refine the materials, bearing in mind any pedagogical or ethical issues. Okay, thank you very much. I'm not sure if there was any questions in there, but I don't know, maybe Louise or Bethan can tell me if there was any. I wasn't able to watch at the same time, unfortunately. I think basically, it's sort of reiterating, many of the issues that have already been raised by other people in the group. As a materials writer, it was an interesting process to go through, because as materials writers, we're increasingly being asked by publishers to make use of ChatGPT. And I think that's sort of where I was, in fact, having engaged with ChatGPT before doing that. It was just a useful exercise to do that and see how far I could, without using any other resources other than ChatGPT. And of course, I was sort of working on, a communications model that I know inside out and upside down, the Spikes model. So I was already Virginia, at least for me, for the Spikes model, what should be included in an effective training for developing the Spikes model. But I think overall it probably, gave me a bit of confidence to use it elsewhere as well. As I say, it's very anecdotal. And probably a lot of you have already gone through this same process yourselves. Not sure, Bethan or Louise, if you had any comments on that. Is it something that you've engaged with yourselves? How far have you got with it?
Hi, Ros. I was just typing in the chat, but I'll say it here. I thought it was really interesting how one of the what I would have seen as unexpected benefits was leading you to resources you knew but had forgotten about, or perhaps new resources. So the empathy podcast again is something that I haven't come across, and looks really interesting. So I thought that was a nice unexpected perhaps benefit of using it for your course development.
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. The hallucination issue, has already been talked about earlier today, and that is something. But it is, as we go back to that issue, is all about it's about critical thinking as well. But luckily, I know a lot about spikes. I know, the history. I know how it should be used, and so when I did click on that link, I knew what it was supposed to be showing me, an article by et al., but it didn't. But and I think if you had come from it not knowing about spikes, then it definitely would have thrown you off. Neil says, I've engaged with Gemini for developing courses in an area which I knew nothing about. So risk management in Sharia banking. Oh, right. Wow. Scary. I don't even think I would attempt anything to do with finance. But yeah, it gives you that little bit of confidence. And I was following, this sort of course of action that Rob Howard had done, because with the issue that he'd been asked, the topic that he'd been asked to teach on, he didn't know anything about at all, and so he went through these stages. Yeah, sorry, Louise, did you have a comment or
Yeah,
anything?
just I just like how you reminded us how important the writing really detailed specific prompts is when you use ChatGPT, because I think the more information you give it, the better it can be. And sometimes I forget that. I just expect it to know what I want it to do, and you have to be like really, really precise. And then you obviously get something that you can then work with yourself. That was good.
Yeah. Yeah, well, me too as well. But equally, I was also surprised by sometimes how my prompts were a little bit vague, and it came up with stuff, and I'm thinking, oh,
Mhm.
gosh, did it really do that? So it's clearly improving, and it's clearly everything. It's changing as we go along, and I'm by no means an expert in this at all. And I think we've got people, sort of with us today that are far more expert in that area. Timea is saying my experience. So she talks about her experience. And in fact, this is what we have heard in most presentations is the main point about using AI, including teaching and academic writing, is that you can only use it wisely and reliably if you have a good understanding of the topic or field that you're applying it to, and your approach is AI critical. And I believe this is what we need to bear in mind when using AI, and we need to help students understand, believe, and see clearly. No, absolutely, absolutely. And that sort of coupled with the point that I was trying to make at the end is that when you're designing materials, always bear in mind the core principles of designing materials for ESP, and particularly with those specifics related to our field. It's imperative that we continue to use a framework that is tried and tested in terms of developing materials, and use that, apply that knowledge as well in your design of materials, particularly for our field where accuracy is so important. But yeah, I was pleasantly surprised, let me say, pleasantly surprised.
No, thank you. It was really interesting. Really, really interesting.
You're very welcome. All right, okay. So apologies, as I said, if you thought you were going to be hearing Petra, unfortunately she couldn't be with us today.